Welcome back to Spreadsheets and Sliders, where the GMs are sharp, the Sims are cruel, and we're all just looking for spreadsheet glory in a virtual world.
We're your hosts. I'm Aaron Mariners, and with me is Jacob Red Sox. In this episode, we cover one of the most chaotic off seasons in recent memory, with old contenders seemingly reaching the ends of their competitive windows, and some new challengers making aggressive moves to take their places.
We also saw one of the most talented free agent classes in Top Shelf's history create a market unlike what we're used to seeing.
To start off the pod today, we're going to look at Baltimore, who ended up signing two of the big international free agents to pretty affordable deals, honestly.
Yeah, Baltimore had a really successful offseason, in my opinion. They signed Ken Lung Song, one of the top free agent starting pitchers. Now, he is a little older at 31 years old, but they picked up a guy that by our scouts is very, very highly rated at a contract of 6 years, 120 million. In the first year, he's only being paid 12.5. And, with the contracts that we've seen for starting pitchers in recent years in Top Shelf, this is a complete steal, in my opinion.
Oh, easily, yeah. Both guys have been signed, guaranteed through the 2037 season. Montoya still has a year and then a player option after that. Sung has the player option in 2038. And even though the superstars of the Orioles are expiring in the next couple of years, these two should hopefully anchor a strong rebuilding effort moving forward.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things about these guys too is again, it kind of loops back to the contract. With both of these guys expecting to perform at a high level right out of the gate, even though they're older, if Baltimore is able to put a better team around them this year, then great. The rebuilding is a success. However, being on these low AAV contracts means that if for whatever reason Baltimore believes that its timeline has to be extended and they need a little bit longer to rebuild, these guys are very affordable, very high value assets that could still be flipped for more, whether it's this year, next year, or even a couple of years down the road.
Yeah, and honestly, Baltimore is kind of exciting coming into the year just because we're finally going to be seeing the major league debut of the number 13 MLB prospect Brandon Tafuri. He was their first round pick back in 2028, and he had been on GM's minds as a trade target for years, and Baltimore had stood fast for the entirety of him being there. And now, finally, after a really strong showing in AAA last year, it looks like he's going to break camp as the potential second baseman for the major league club.
Yeah, currently in spring training, I see him penciled in at the number three spot, and that's a really, really prestigious spot for a rookie to hold in the lineup. So we'll have to see if he, mixed with a few of these older veterans, can help Baltimore bounce back from a relatively disappointing last year.
Yeah, up in Toronto, they actually signed a huge free agent deal as well, claiming Mike Bove, who had spent the last few seasons in Milwaukee, picking up that world championship a couple years back.
Yeah, the Mike Bowe pickup is really nice in Toronto. He should bring some stability back to that lineup that really, really underperformed last year. Again, this name comes up pretty much every year in the podcast, but I'll keep bringing it up because I love him. Dylan O'Ray was unfortunately one of the absolute worst batters in all of Major League Baseball. Fortunately, he's still only 29. His ratings overall haven't really tanked into the gutter. But even the leftover percentile ratings of 2032 aren't pretty. First value batting runs, first percentile exit velocity, and first percentile in barrel and hard hit percentage. So even though he's likely not to become a slugger, you expect a guy with the track record of a to jump back into more of a neutral position. And if that happens, along with a guy who's been super consistent in Bove, then Toronto, who actually was not very far off from a wild card spot last year, could bounce back, especially in a division like the AL East, which is suddenly wide open.
Yeah, and I think most notably for Toronto, when they ended up letting go of Mason Fluharty and sticking with Reiselman as their closer, it was definitely a difficult move when Reiselman immediately became wrecked right after that extension. But I just see here that he successfully completed his strength and conditioning program this offseason, which brings him from wrecked back up to fragile. So it's not a perfect fix, but it does at least give the Blue Jays hopefully some more stability in the back end of that bullpen. Now, I think some of the biggest changes in the division actually come from Tampa Bay. They made a couple moves that were pretty high profile this offseason, picking up Peter Lane and Eric Veras to front that starting rotation, as well as shipping out Chase Burns to Seattle and getting the number 13 overall prospect Alexis Gaona back.
Yeah, Tampa Bay, in my opinion, is going to be the team to beat in the East this year. They are huge in terms of their prospect capital. We've known that for years. They've had a top three system, top two system for a long time now. But at this point, now we're getting some established veterans in here to really force the issue and look for Tampa Bay to start winning right now. Eric Veras had a very, very good year for the Miami Marlins last year, had a 154 ERA plus, pitched almost 200 innings to a 2.61 ERA. Peter Lane was an up and comer with Boston, and he is continuing to develop. Had a league average year, but he's under team control and he's very close to fully developed. And I think another underrated pickup that they had was Sam Antonacci, the World Series winner in 2031 with the Chicago White Sox. He should bring some stability into the lineup, which was unfortunately very, very weak last year. But again, with a lot of these guys coming up and developing, Tampa Bay has a lot of promise. And with these veteran presences, I think that they could make some real noise, not just the East, but the American League this year.
Yeah, Antonacci was probably one of the more underrated acquisitions across the whole league, just because he's not a big flashy name. He's more of a contact hitter, a little bit of gap power here and there, and a little bit of speed. But he's been pretty good on defense. He was in the White Sox system for a while, and he had been put on the trade block year in, year out for multiple years. Eventually, he just ended up sticking around and putting up 4 WAR 2 seasons ago during their championship run, and last year another 3 WAR, and now he's right over here in Tampa to sort of shore up that infield defense. It's only on a $5 million deal right now, so there's no long-term commitment in case he doesn't pan out. But at 30 years old, he provides a great leadership presence in an extremely young Tampa lineup.
Yeah, Antonacci, other than veteran catcher Dylan Dingler, is the oldest player in this Tampa Bay lineup. Most of these guys are 27 or younger, in fact. So we'll have to see whether or not they can get their consistency up this year, as especially Danny Wallace, who was traded for at the deadline last year, will be looking to bounce back after having a disappointing debut in Tampa Bay.
Now, in stark contrast to the Tampa Bay roster construction currently, the Yankees are still on the sort of older side with their roster. Most of their money is currently being paid to players who are 30 or older, with the most notable acquisition being Paul Skeens. He's just about to turn 31, and he ended up signing a 5-year, $227 million deal with the Yankees just a couple of weeks ago after he had a pretty decent second half of the season last year with Colorado.
Yeah, the Skeens signing by the Yankees was one of the more surprising ones. Not in the sense that the Yankees were willing to spend money. Everybody knows that they have all the money in the world to spend. But for a team that's kind of in their position, I'm interested to see what they're going to do with Skeens. He's had a very nice second half of the year, as you mentioned, with Colorado, and he parlayed that into a nice big payday, a 5-year deal with an opt out after 3 years. But I wonder what he'll do for the Yankees specifically this year, because unfortunately there are still definitely holes in this team. They ranked pretty much at the bottom of every metric at the end of the year last year. And while both Gabriel Arias and Paul Skeens, who were their big offseason signings, should help in many of those aspects, it's unlikely to me that it'll push them all the way back into playoff contention. So I'm wondering whether or not these veteran signings might be fodder later for maybe a retained deal in a trade to get some assets, or maybe they'll just be tasked to lead a young rotation or a young lineup as prospects get promoted. But I'm interested to see what the Yankees do.
Yeah, I mean they brought in Gabriel Arias as well to fill a similar niche. Skeens is also probably going to be there as a veteran leader to help the development of Jose Ortiz, who came out last year with the Yankees as their sort of de facto ace. He almost put up 200 innings, and he ended up developing pretty well over the course of the last 2 seasons. My scout has him going from 40 up to 49 current. And even though his stamina took a little bit of a hit, he still has that coveted ground ball with a really strong control movement profile that a lot of us GMs crave. And so you bring in a guy like Skeens, and Ortiz all of a sudden doesn't have all the pressure on him anymore. He has the ability to sit back and learn and fit into that number 2 hole instead of the front of the rotation, which should hopefully help his development as he is only 23 years old.
Finally, in the AL East, we have the previous division winners and the multiple time division winners over the life of Top Shelf, the Boston Red Sox. Now, Boston is looking at a huge overhaul this offseason. They made a number of moves, and I'm interested to see what an outsider's perspective is on those moves.
Well, Boston was sort of dealt a really heavy blow when Kumar Rocker went down for the year with a torn UCL last year, and he's still going to be on the shelf for a few months. Unfortunately, at age 33, that means that his time in the rotation might be coming to a close relatively soon, and that means that Boston needs to start developing some young starters. Mike Garner and Vic Lemos are 2 of those guys who are ready to go, and I know that you, Jacob, put Garner through a development program and have already seen huge dividends coming from that.
Yeah, Garner is one of those guys that I was really excited to pick up over the offseason. I think he was a little bit underrated in terms of being prospect rankings when he was traded for, and he's done nothing but ascend for me over this offseason. Now, of course, we have to see whether or not he can put those results on the field, but he's pushed all the way up to our scouts rating of a 49.58. So I'm really excited to see what he can do over the course of a full season with a rotation spot guaranteed. The rest of the moves basically in the Boston were kind of signaling towards, I think, the end of an era, so to speak. Roman Anthony's still around, Kiko Fujioka's still around, but it just seemed like the last few years in the playoffs, even though we were making it and even though we were winning the division, we didn't feel like real contenders to me. The offense didn't always feel like it was championship level. And, there was just some inconsistency in other parts of the rotation, even though the bullpen has, for the most part, been pretty stalwart. So we shipped out Junior Caminero, we shipped out fan favorite Masahito Onishi, and we got some assets back for a few pitchers. Peter Lane went to Tampa Bay, and Miguel Duran and George McLeod were sent as bullpen help to a couple of other teams.
Yeah, but most notably from Tampa in particular, you got Chris Rathbone back, and he comes in at the number 16 prospect right now. Where do you see him playing this year if he's going to start in the major leagues?
Rathbone, I'm really excited about. I think he was a great part of the negotiations in Tampa Bay, and we're really excited to have picked him up. He played a really nice second base in the minors last year, but we have a number of really strong infield players at the major league level. So we'll have to see. He's definitely rated very highly at first base. So if he has a good spring, he definitely has a chance to win a job either there or at the DH spot. But this year is definitely going to be a developed year. So I am excited to have some younger guys on the field and to be watching their performance rather than, necessarily the standings, I think. Taking us over to the AL Central now, I want to start with the Chicago White Sox because they're one of the teams that signed another big international free agent in starting pitcher Grisha Karachev.
Yeah, Karachev was my top target for the offseason, and unfortunately, I ended up getting into a bidding war that was just slightly over my head. And he ends up going to the White Sox. But good on them because they're now able to front a rotation that already has a number of promising pitchers. Mackenzie Gore has been there for a couple of years now, pitching at an all-star level, and Santiago Suarez is, as good as he's always been. He's been there for 2 years now, and he's been ace level production.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see what the White Sox rotation looks like. Karachev is our first Uzbek starter in the major, so congratulations to him and the people there. But we're looking at a White Sox team that is really known for, kind of changing iterations and retooling during the off seasons. The GM there is always tinkering with the rosters, never sitting on his hands. And I really admire that in a sense because he's always looking to try and get better. And we've seen that now with some stuff shipped out, which got him a chance to bid on Karachev. He did move some big pieces out, though. First baseman Luke Adams was traded to Arizona. Relief pitcher Carson Skipper was traded to San Diego. And as mentioned previously with the Tampa Bay, Sam Antonacci was also traded there. So there are definitely some major league quality pieces being sent out. But the assets coming back and the money freed up coming back is definitely being used and invested back into the major league roster. It's not a rebuilding effort, it's a retooling effort. And to replace Adams, he got Devison De Los Santos, who has played very well for both Miami and Chicago, and picked up catcher Logan O'Hoppe in free agency.
Yeah, additionally, with Antonacci leaving town, there's a number of pretty strong candidates to fill that second base spot in the lineup. Chicago last year rolled out Grady Emerson, Justin Berry, Nick Ellis, and Cooper Pratt just on the left side of the infield alone. And obviously, you can slot one of those guys into the DH slot, or you can put De Los Santos into the DH slot. But Pratt and Emerson fill a very, very similar role, being able to play short and third both very well. The guy I actually have my eye on is their third base prospect, their first round pick from 2030, Nick Ellis. He was here for the championship team, and he has had huge rating boosts over the last year, year and a half, 2 years. Last year, in his second year in the majors, he was starting to put things together, ended up putting up 15 home runs and had some pretty strong power metrics. But I think Nick Ellis really needs to step up this year and take charge of the team now that Luke Adams, their feared slugger, has left.
Yeah, Nick Ellis is really a big breakout candidate this year. Like you said, taking charge. I mean, he's definitely captain material, as we've seen in all of his scouting reports. So it'll be up to him to kind of take these realized ratings because our scouts have him as 70 realized power, 60 realized I. And we're not seeing too big a platoon split in his underlying talent. So I think this year could be a big year for him. He's age 25, he's entering his prime. This is his second full year in the majors. And yeah, he's going to have a spot in the lineup carved out for him. He should have that full 162 games to really prove to everybody that he can be that guy and be one of those franchise cornerstones after being drafted in the first round in 2030. Speaking of teams that love to make adjustments, let's talk about Detroit. We have a team here that is making a ton of changes once again in the offseason, and it looks like Detroit is really trying to get back into the postseason picture. And I think that with the moves that they've made, they may be taking good steps towards that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the pieces that Detroit ended up picking up in the offseason was the relief pitcher Bradley Rodriguez. He's been fantastic for a number of years in St. Louis. And last year, actually, he was in a setup role for St. Louis. He's expected to go back to that closer's role now that he's here in Detroit, but he's only one of a few pieces that they've got going for them this preseason.
Yeah, Rodriguez is joining Kiyomitsu Matsui as another piece of that revamped bullpen. And Detroit had a number of issues last year. Unfortunately, they weren't really excelling in any regard, and they made a ton of trades as they kind of seem to do at the deadline. A couple of players definitely moved from them that are useful to other teams. We're seeing center field Byron Churio was traded to Cincinnati, and relief pitcher Xiaoyan Han was traded to Seattle. In addition, one of our longest lasting veterans here in Top Shelf, starting pitcher Zach Wheeler, he retired this offseason as well. So that left a bit of a hole for Detroit to fill.
Yeah, and fortunately, Detroit has one ace up their sleeve in starting pitcher Luis Gomez. He's been doing really, really well over the last couple seasons. Actually, my most recent scout has his stuff going up to 70 current, his overall going up to 64, and his potential going up to 67. So he's right there on the cusp of being among the league elite. And I think the Detroit GM recognized that right away this offseason when he signed him to another 5-year extension for $74 million. Actually, that's really good value for someone of that talent level. Only about 15 a year for the next 5 years.
Yeah, being able to get Gomez for that price, I think is really, really good for Detroit in the long term. In addition, I want to point out that Detroit was one of the biggest beneficiaries of the R5 draft this offseason, as they added 7 players through the draft.
Yeah, Detroit did end up taking David Daly, one of the top 100 prospects in the league in the R5 draft from the San Francisco Giants, but then they just flipped him right around to the Miami Marlins in exchange for reliever John Schlegel and reliever Jacob Bresnahan, opting instead for pitchers who might be able to help them more in the short term. And finally, right here at the end, Detroit was able to sign Creed Willems to a 3-year deal at the end of the preseason. Now, Willems had been a really, really hot bat in Baltimore for 3 or 4 years after the departure of Samuel Basayo in their own system. But over the last year or so, he's taken a little bit of a step back, especially after Willems ended up getting traded to Chicago midway through last season. He really didn't pull his way into the season with an 81 OPS plus in that second half. So hopefully Detroit's able to just stash him either in the DH slot or as a part of that catcher platoon, since Jose Ramirez, their current catcher, is really only strong against left-handed pitching.
Next on our list in the Central are the Kansas City Royals. Now, they're one of the few teams that actually didn't make any major additions or subtractions via free agency or trade this offseason, but they did do a lot with their internal options. Namely, they extended a lot of these foundational pieces that they're hoping will carry them through the next era of Royals baseball.
Yeah, Frank Mozzicato was on the trade block in the middle of last year because he was at the end of his existing deal. He ended up getting extended for 4 more years, so he and Christian Scott can still provide that really strong 1-2 at the front of the rotation. Additionally, Braylon Morrell, the left fielder for Kansas City, he has now signed for an additional 5 years, and Graham Seaberg is now going to be joining Coy James, being signed through 2038 to make up the middle of that Kansas City infield.
Yeah, Kansas City having these extensions done is really helpful because these extensions are generally below market value for the most part. And that really helps with a small market like Kansas City. We've seen them kind of teeter in and out of, postseason contention and, with how the Central has been, not really in recent years, but over its history and Top Shelf has been one of the weaker divisions. They've kind of battled near the top and near the end of the wild card race. So I'm hoping that these guys that have these big potentials that are really coming into their prime now, these prime years, can really give Kansas City a big enough foundation so that they can truly become a real contender in that Central Division.
Yeah, and speaking of contenders, Minnesota has been right there at the top for the last few seasons. They ended up making quite a few moves of their own in free agency, most notably buffing up their pitching staff with Bo Brisky coming from Miami, Yoyi Yuen coming from free agency, and Cade Vernon, the former San Francisco Giant who signed recently, to be a part of that starting rotation.
Yeah, Vernon comes in actually replacing starting pitcher David Festa, who Minnesota let go to free agency. Festa has definitely talent. I think that's pretty unquestionable. But unfortunately, even by my scouts, without having him in my clubhouse, he's had a bit of a reputation. He's unkindly been put as a clubhouse cancer. So even though he does have a lot of talent and Minnesota is in a contending mode, I can see why they would let a guy like that go. And hopefully Cade Vernon can come in and pick up that slack. I do think that Yoyi Yuen is going to be one of those underrated pickups for them. He pitched in Boston for a number of years for me, and he's been very, very good there. Toyed a bit with him as a starter since he started out with a lot of stamina. Still has it quite a bit, but he definitely thrived once he was put in a relief role, and he's able to eat up a lot of bulk innings and give you some quality middle relief.
Yeah, and Minnesota's pitching staff hasn't been bad. Their relief core has really been where their strength has lied for the past few seasons. Even back when they had David Hageman in that ninth inning role, now they have Anderson Ramos, who is far and away the highest rated reliever that I have. He's 80-80 and has completely elite ratings across the board. Last season, he only put up 12 saves. Could be part of just what the team has just been managing their pitching staff. But he just went through his first year of arbitration, and he should be an extension candidate right away for Minnesota.
Definitely agree on that. And then another thing that I think that was interesting that Minnesota did was they actually shipped out catcher Cooper Ingle and traded him to Chicago. They did pick up another catcher in return, Aaron Walker. By most scouts, I think he's generally perceived to be less talented between the two, but I'm interested to see what your take is on that move.
I don't really see Aaron Walker as anything major. I think Minnesota already has a much stronger catcher on their roster with Bo Peterson. He's been really good in his limited time in the majors, and he's still going to be under team control for another 5 seasons. So it's not like Aaron Walker was coming in to improve the position. He's really just coming in to be a supplemental defensive piece, the way I see it. Honestly, you could probably even get better value if someone else has him rated higher. You could just trade him out and find someone similar, since he's already made 2 moves this offseason alone. So someone has him rated highly. But in terms of big moves, I don't think this is one of them for Minnesota.
On the topic of big moves, let's move to the final team in the American League Central. We have the Cleveland Guardians. Now, they've popped up on the podcast for a number of years as a sleeper team, but this year I really do think that they've made moves in the right direction, addressing issues that they had in the previous season. I'm really a big fan of the fact they added 2 star bats in left fielder Wyatt Langford and third baseman Kobe Mayo. Both of these guys in trades respectively from Texas and Miami.
Yeah, both guys are still elite. Kobe Mayo's in the last year of his deal right now. Langford actually also was in the last year of his deal. So both guys might end up just being rentals for this Cleveland organization. They have the pitching, honestly, to get them far into the playoffs if they can survive the regular season. Kuriyama's the best that there is. Tim Katucci's finally hitting those realized ratings and was able to put up almost 200 innings last year for the first time. So that was a huge relief, I'm sure, for the Cleveland GM. And then just last year, the longtime #1 prospect in the country, Eric Altum, finally hit the majors to create that huge 3-headed monster that Cleveland now has at the top of their rotation.
Yeah, that pitching staff is no joke. And I think the thing is that we've really realized that over the last few seasons. Like, yes, Katucci is really reaching his apex now, but we've known that the Cleveland pitching staff can pull their weight and that they're really built for a postseason. It's the offense that has unfortunately been one of the worst units in the league, despite the level of talent they've kind of visually had over the last couple of seasons. But the addition of Mayo and Langford brings consistency in both OBP and power. I mean, these guys are really complete hitters. So I'm hoping that this really stabilizes the lineup for them and allows them to, even if they push to a league average offense, they can suddenly make a lot of noise in the American League.
Yeah, and Cleveland did have to give up a couple of prospects in return, both to Texas for Wyatt Langford. That ended up being a massive trade. But what Cleveland gained was the ability for their lineup to be fearsome across the board, top to bottom. Last year, they were really depending on a few guys in particular because Jason Churio wasn't having a very good season, and Josh McCloskey had a down year as well. It was really Christian Hernandez and Welvin Francisca that just carried the offense on their back. And so Bringing in a couple more guys to fit into that 3, 4, 5 hole in the lineup will take a ton of pressure off those guys. It'll hopefully help the roster stay a little bit healthier, and it'll definitely help Cleveland compete amongst the likes of the White Sox and the Twins in the next couple of seasons.
As we turn our eyes to the AL West, let's keep on this same topic and talk about the other side of that major Wyatt Langford trade, the Texas Rangers. Now, their offseason is something that we're not really used to from them. This is a rebuild slash retooling effort from them as they shipped out a major piece of their lineup over the last number of years in Wyatt Langford and picked up a couple of top 100 prospects in return.
Yeah, they were able to pick up Jason Johnson and Willie Cabrera both in that trade with Cleveland. Johnson, I see as being one of the cornerstones for them in the near future. He was only in high A last year in his first year in minor league baseball, but he is already well on his way to being major league ready. He's probably only a year out. He already has 60 realized I and 45 power. So you just need a little bit more on both of those, and he should be able to fit right into that Texas future. Now, on the major league roster, we've talked ad nauseum about Josh Springer's development in the Texas system over the last 3 years, blasting onto the scene in 2030 and then having two more really strong campaigns after that. Last year's surprise story, I think, was Jerry Lamson, their left fielder, who ended up putting up a 285, 372, 483 batting line across 100 games last year. He came in about a third of the way into the season and ended up having a very strong second half. He should be primed to get full-time at bats now that Langford is gone.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what the Texas Rangers lineup looks like going into this next season because you have Lamson, as you mentioned, but you have guys that we're probably not going to be used to seeing in the lineup. The Texas Rangers roster is not a young roster. It's not the oldest in the majors, but these are veteran guys that are primed to win. You've got Nick Kurtz, you've got Ezekiel Tovar. These are guys that have World Series titles and have playoff appearances and playoff MVPs. So I'm wondering what this mix of young talent and new guys is going to be meaning for the Rangers because I know that they put up a bigger trade block that they ended up moving over this offseason. So is this still going to be another time where they're trying to contend with the big boys in the West? Or will they move more of these veteran pieces and try and retool for a more sustainable future period? It's hard to say for me because a lot of these guys are still really good. Ezekiel Tovar is performing still to an MVP level as a shortstop. Nick Kurtz is great. Sal Frelick, who they picked up last year, was okay. They're looking for maybe a bounce back this year. And you still have, like we said, Josh Springer, who is as good as ever. So what they do with these pieces is anybody's guess.
Yeah, and right there at the top of the division for the last couple of years has been Anaheim, who didn't really make too many moves this offseason. They lost Cade Smith to free agency, which isn't that big of a deal for Anaheim because their bullpen for the last 5, 6 years has just been an embarrassment of riches. Andres Munoz still performing at a really high level. Brody Brecht, I have always been in love with his production in that stopper role, and Anaheim just keeps pumping out high leverage relievers to jump in where needed. Fortunately, the big thing that Anaheim did manage to accomplish this offseason was being able to sign Blake Mitchell to a max term deal. He ended up signing for 8 years, 264 million, which is the maximum length, and it puts him under team control until the year 2040, far longer than anyone else on the roster currently.
Yeah, Blake Mitchell, I think, takes the record for the longest contract signed in top shelf history. And to be honest with you, he's really earned it, in my opinion. I mean, you look at his percentile rankings in 2032 for most of his advanced stats, and basically it's just a sea of blue and green. He's pretty much, by and large, the best and most complete catcher in all of Major League Baseball. He is a little bit older and at age 28, and it could be a risk to hold on to that for 8 full years. But at the same time, there's no one else in the major leagues that you can say that has the realized combination of fielding and hitting. And it's just something that you don't see in this position these days.
Yeah, Mitchell still has a lot of power, which is a big deal because Anaheim probably wanted a couple more years of production out of Cal Raleigh when they signed him a couple years ago. But after he had that 21 home run campaign in 2030, he just sort of fell off a cliff. And the fact that they were able to acquire Blake Mitchell at all last year was a tremendous deal for Anaheim because he put up essentially a full season of stats in what ended up being 85 games for them. So it would have been really tragic for Anaheim if they had to let him go and try to find that same level of production elsewhere. So I'm glad to see that the GM was able to move some money around and prioritize that premier position.
Yeah, outside of that, Anaheim is still poised to be one of the best teams in all of baseball. I mean, none of these players have moved from their roster that are the linchpins. I mean, they have Pete Crow Armstrong still in center field. Their rotation is going to be returning basically healthy from the last couple of years. It's been one of the best in all of baseball. They're really just one of the most consistent teams over the last 3 or 4 years, and it's really impressive to see what they've built and how good they've been for this long.
Yeah, and last year's sort of surprise contender, Las Vegas, they also had a pretty quiet offseason, but they made a huge splash last year in signing Bobby Witt Jr., and they followed it up this year by signing Nolan Schanuel in free agency to shore up that first base position.
Yeah, Las Vegas is coming off of a quiet offseason because honestly, I mean, the old adage goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And last year, they were the number one seed in all of Major League Baseball. They had 102 wins. They were fantastic all year. Yes, they unfortunately did not make it out of their first playoff series, but you can kind of chalk that up to being, more of a young team. And this year, these guys are going to have that postseason experience, and everybody key is returning. And also, importantly, there's not anybody listed currently in any long-term injuries. So you have a full rotation, you have that full bullpen, the full lineup. Guys like Hiromoto Mukai, who unfortunately missed a bit of time last year after being a splash signing, he'll return. He's pitching great for them last year. He should be a big piece of that bullpen. And I'm really excited to see what this team does in year two after such a big ascent in year one.
Yeah, I am really hoping to see Melvin Matos break out this year. Last year, I think the giant candidate was Kevin Myers. He ended up landing his first All Star nomination and was able to land that Silver Slugger award at first base at the end of the season. This year, Melvin Matos has equally as impressive ratings across the board. I have him as blue in gap power, power, and eye. And even though he doesn't play great defense, he's still an exceptional hitter. Last year, he missed just over the first month of the season due to injury, so he was only able to get 99 starts under his belt. But if he's able to put up anything close to the numbers that he did last year, where he ended with a 126 OPS plus, that's already a tremendous advantage for Vegas in what's become a very competitive division across Top Shelf's history.
100%. And another thing that I want to point out is that they've really seen some big development scouting wise from their starting rotation. Pretty much all of these guys now are pretty close to their ceiling. Our scouts don't have anybody other than David Jenkins, who is currently a 66 rating, more than 3 or 4 points away from their true potential. And these guys were a fantastic unit last year. I am super excited to see what they can do. And, Vegas really spent a lot in terms of draft capital and trades in order to put this unit together. I'm really hoping that they show out in the upcoming season.
Yeah, honestly, we're still expecting something similar to happen with the ascent of Houston over the past few seasons. Last year in the preseason pod, we thought Houston was going to make a run for the division lead. They ended up under 500 for the season, 2 games under 500, which at least to me was mildly disappointing. I think we were all expecting their rotation to be the absolute best in the league, and it felt kind of flat because Talon Haley took a step back, Hector Mancilla wasn't great, and Fernie Gonzalez wasn't great either. Fortunately, Nicholas Arnaud was able to come up and put up some pretty good numbers in his rookie season, and he's going to be right back there in the middle of that rotation. But Jacob, finally, after so much hype and so many years in the league now, Georgie Larson is improving his control by a simple 5 points, and it's landed him a huge 8 year extension.
Yeah, Georgie Larson remains one of my favorite pitchers to watch in all of Top Shelf. Uncle Bill here, every year that he's been in the majors, has led a statistical category. All 3 years he's led the league in K per nine. Last 2 years he's led the league in Ks raw, and he led the league in starts last year with 35. He has pretty much the best pure stuff in all of baseball, and I honestly think that that minor 5 points that you mentioned is major here for Larson because if he can cut his walk rate just a little bit, he should be a significantly better pitcher going forward. He's actually improved year on year, and his ERA has gone down bit by bit by bit. And at still only 26, there's the sky is the limit for this kid.
He has a pretty good amount of help on the back end right now. A number of relief pitchers that are performing at elite levels for Houston. Angel Peralta is now up to 70-70 by my scout. Houston also picked up Miguel Duran in that trade with Boston. And one of the best kept secrets in the league, in my opinion, is Dylan Sewing. He's one of their high leverage relievers. He's been in the league for 3 years now. Last year, he put up ridiculous first half numbers, but he was completely buried because he ended up missing the second half of the season. Jacob, if you ever get a chance to look over there, he's top 5 percentile in every major pitching metric, and he put up a 12.54 ERA plus across 30 innings last season. 12.54. That's insane.
I mean, it's definitely nuts. He was by and large the absolute best in the league at preventing high exit velocities. His average exit velocity was only 77.4 miles per hour. And I really am looking at him to hopefully be able to do more for Houston this year and hopefully not get hurt because he had such an amazing start last year and has been slotted as the closer for a number of years. So Houston will definitely be looking at him to take a bigger load as they, move to more high leverage opportunities when they try to compete in this American League West.
Yeah, the Astros pitching is going to be fearsome, but we said this again last year, so hopefully they can actually live up to it this year, assuming obviously good health across the board. Now, on offense, the Astros have had a couple really strong players over the last couple of years. Wade Shelley had a really strong season 2 years ago, and last year Ronnie Bayo was in the running for multiple major award categories at the very end of the season, having put up a whopping 6.3 WAR at third base. He was the main power threat in that lineup, so a lot of pressure was on him to put up the run support for these young Houston pitchers. But this year, Houston was able to go out and acquire Junior Caminero from the Red Sox. Now, Caminero did have a down year last year, but a down year for Caminero is a career year for a lot of other players in the league. So even at a $25 million a year price tag, Caminero, as long as he could put up like a 120 OPS plus over the next couple seasons in Houston, that's really more than they could have bargained for when they need to support this pitching staff as best they can.
Yeah, I mean, as the guy who traded Caminero away, I really am sad to see him go. When he came to Boston, he really transformed the lineup. And anytime that he was injured, he was sorely missed for his stable presence the entire year. Unfortunately, because of some retooling that we decided to do as an organization, we figured that he might do better in somewhere that's trying to win. And, at age 29, I really do think that he's got a bounce back season in him. Again, like you mentioned, he'd had a down year, but it's not like it was an overly bad year. 104 OPS plus, 18 home runs, 85 RBIs. But he'll be looking to kind of lead this young lineup and help Houston reach its full potential. Finally, we come to the Seattle Mariners. Now, this is another team that made a big shift in the offseason, but in the opposite direction that a lot of these other ones have. There are some major additions to Seattle, and after a brief hiatus, now looks like they're repositioning to take a crack at that extremely competitive top of the AL West.
Yeah, 3 seasons now with 83 or fewer wins, which has been honestly not that fun, especially for the fan base. I know that we lost a lot of fan loyalty and a lot of fan interest. Surprisingly, upon this most recent acquisition of Chase Burns, our fan interest went from 85 up to 98. So 13 points, which is, I don't know how that even happens from one player, but I'll take it. But I think our offense, top to bottom, can go right there up against anyone in the league. We were top 3 in runs last season in the league. And even though Benny has dropped a little bit in rating over the past few seasons, Cole Young is coming off an MVP campaign. Zach Neto's still performing at a really high level. And Kyle Teal ended up actually having the best offensive campaign of his career, which I don't think I expected. I don't think anyone expected, honestly. He ended up having an insane second half of the season to end up being third in the league in batting average by the end of the season. So at least between the top 5 of my lineup and a couple of the pitching acquisitions we made, I'm really hoping that we can be competitive this year just because it's been 3 years of losing and that's just been awful for morale across the board. So hopefully we can actually turn it around this year.
Yeah, I want to talk a second about these pitching acquisitions because all the major acquisitions you've made this offseason were either starting rotation or bullpen related. And I want to point out that they didn't come without cost. You traded out 2 top 100 prospects, 1 top 15 prospect. But again, you just mentioned it earlier, but you got one of the absolute best pitchers in baseball as a return in Chase Burns. And Eric Yeager is also no slouch.
Right when I made the trade for Eric Yeager, right when the offseason opened up, I thought he was going to be fronting my rotation. I had no plans to do any other acquisitions in terms of trades, like giving up assets. I thought that I might be able to find someone in free agency, but I got outbid on pretty much all the ace starting pitchers in free agency, and that left me with the Hail Mary option of putting some of my top prospects on the trade block and hoping to see if anyone would cough up an established star. Fortunately, Tampa came to the table with Chase Burns, and I was more than happy to see that come across the table because, as much as I've loved developing Alexis Gauna, I don't really have a place for him right now. He's going to be good in the league for the next 15 years. There's no doubt about that. But I still have Cole Young and Jamie Darcy under contract and performing at a really high level for a long time. So it's not like Gauna has anywhere to jump right into the major league roster. It could come back to bite me if, for whatever reason, Chase Burns all of a sudden regresses, but in terms of preparation for this upcoming season, he's head and shoulders above the performance of Jaeger, and I'm more than happy to see that as my 1-2 at the front of the rotation going into 2033. Now let's move over to the National League, and we'll start with the West, which houses our defending World Series champion, San Diego Padres. They've made 3 major additions this offseason, 2 by way of free agency with Mason Fluharty and Francisco Alvarez, and they were able to pick up Carson Skipper to help bolster their already strong bullpen.
Yeah, San Diego focused last deadline on reinforcing that bullpen, and it paid off in the postseason. So we're looking at them basically continuing that trend. They did let Yohan Duran go in free agency, but as you said, they replaced him with someone who's arguably better at this point in their career in Mason Fluharty. And Carson Skipper is no slouch as well in a middle relief role or even a leverage role if necessary. Another one is we've known for a long time that San Diego's GM has a big fascination with having catchers in his organization. He's constantly drafting and picking them up. And another one that he did pick was Francisco Alvarez. Now, he doesn't necessarily need to be a catcher, so to speak, but he's more than holding his own as a hitter in recent years. And so I would be really interested to see where he actually plays in the lineup, probably at DH going forward.
Yeah, it'll be kind of curious to see how spring training shakes out for the San Diego lineup because I know that Pete Housley, their top prospect, is expected to hit the majors this year. He's easily major league ready and he's spent a season and a half now in AAA, absolutely mashing. So I thought that maybe he was going to get the nod at DH coming into the season, but maybe the GM is planning to keep him in the minors for a little bit longer, develop some defense or some contact skills, and start with Alvarez in the majors at DH instead. Either way, the Padres lineup is very formidable across the board on offense and with their pitching, and I think he understands that his window is now, and that's why the San Diego GM has gone ahead and extended a number of his star players for 3 or 4 years, depending on who it is, through 2035 or 2036 to capitalize on this window.
Yeah, we know what the ceiling of this squad can be. I mean, they literally just won the World Series, right? So if everything comes together, we know that this is one of the top rosters in all of baseball. But one of the themes of this offseason and that has been mentioned in the previous segments over and over again is really value of these contracts. As we've seen over the history of Top Shelf, these teams and players have been willing to shell out big bucks for international and established free agents coming in to the free agent pool and basically forcing these bidding wars. I'm really a big fan of how San Diego found value within their system. The extension, particularly to two-way star, as you mentioned, Billy Carlson, is extremely affordable. We're talking about 16 million per year for a player that can play both sides of the ball, has won an MVP at shortstop previously, and basically contributes all over the diamond.
Now, we do have some fresh blood in the league. One of our new GMs is taking over the San Francisco Giants, who already have an ace right up their sleeve with starting pitcher Ty Horn. Been fantastic for them for a few years now and was extended recently, right before the last season. What else do they have going for them coming into this season?
SF is one of the most interesting rosters in the league right now, in my opinion, because they, like you said, have a new GM taking over, and they do have a bunch of pieces left over from that time where they were winning the West for a couple of straight years. I mean, for a while, they were the class of the NL West. Now, they did endure a down year last year as I think their new GM was kind of navigating what their roster looks like after the departure of their previous regime. But he wasted no time in putting his stamp on the roster by signing star starting pitcher Armando Nunez straight out of Mexico. And he is by far one of the most developed starters that we've seen coming into Top Shelf. Our scouts have him at 71-71. Yes, he is 33 years old, and yes, he is getting $45 million a year as a salary. However, somehow the Giants pulled off getting him on a 2-year contract with a player option in year 2. This, for me, mitigates all the risk taken by signing an older starting pitcher, and I'm really interested to see what he can do for them in this year because it looks like they're trying to compete now.
Yeah, I mean, San Francisco, they were able to bring back Moriguchi last year on another free agent deal, and he's still putting up great numbers, essentially as one of the better DHs in the National League. Also, fortunately, the Giants were able to supplement that production with the acquisition of second baseman JJ Weatherholt, who spent his entire career with the St. Louis Cardinals and just came over to San Francisco in this past offseason. He signed a 5-year deal with San Francisco, and he's coming off a year in which he put up a 314, 397, 457 slash line. That 397 OBP is really what stands out to me as a marker of a player's consistency, especially because it allows you to put him all over the lineup card. He could be at the top, he could be in the 5 hole, he could be down at the bottom depending on if he has platoon splits. He just is a great table setter for the rest of the team. And between Moriguchi and Dustin Miller, the Giants need some table setters ahead of those guys.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what their offense does this season, but they have a number of guys that are basically hitting their stride. Johnny Level, we have as 54-63 by our scouts. Moriguchi is Moriguchi. Dustin Miller has been very solid for them, even though he had a down year last year. His career line is very, very good, and he's still hitting 20 plus home runs per year on average. And I think one of the things that's going to be interesting to watch is back onto the pitching side. We've talked ad nauseum about Ty Horn as the de facto ace for SF for a number of years, but one of the cooler experiments that they might be running this year is Josh Hoagland, who was actually their closer last year. He's looking to maybe make a name for himself in the rotation as he's pushed all the way up to a 40 stamina and has starting pitching ratings with, five completely quality, some might even say elite major league pitches.
Yeah, he was picked in the first round in 2027 by the Cubs as a reliever. And over the past few years, he's been steadily improving. He was one of the biggest beneficiaries from the switch from OTP 26 to 27, having gone from, at least by my scout, 47.72 up to 66.75. Part of that was him switching to be classified as a reliever, but that's still a ridiculous amount of growth for any single player. That's nearly 20 points. And even though he only has 30 stamina currently, it's not like he's lost any. As recently as the middle of 2031, he gained a couple stamina points. And honestly, if he just gets to 40 stamina, then he might be able to put up even better numbers than Ben Joyce when he was putting up those great seasons back to back for Anaheim a couple years back. Yeah, speaking of star pitchers, though, if we go over to Arizona, one of their biggest triumph stories from last year was the ability to sort of bring Jacob Steinmetz back from the brink in terms of his injury concerns. He had been wrecked for a long time, and he was finally able to succeed in a dev program that brought him up to fragile and allowed him to surpass 200 innings for the first time since 2029, which was a huge deal for Arizona. Him performing at a high level like that can single-handedly make them contenders. He was well within the Cy Young race last year with a 16-6 record and 6 WAR for the season, and he's by far their ace on that staff. Fortunately, the Arizona GM was also able to sign him to a pretty affordable extension for someone of his ratings and production. Starting after this season, he'll be on a 5-year extension, about 19 mil a year, which is completely affordable for a guy that's 29 and still pitching in his prime like this.
100%. I think the Steinmetz story is one of the best ones in Top Shelf because he's always been a talented pitcher for Arizona. But the fact that he was able to come back from being wrecked to just fragile and then pitching 212 innings last year after not even combining for that in 2031 and 2030. So the fact that he's got that durability up earned him a new contract with the Diamondbacks, and they're hoping that he can continue to keep that trend as he's a very affordable ace for them, averaging just about $19 million per year. Very, very good. And he'll anchor a rotation that's going to be essentially looked to prevent runs because the Diamondbacks lineup is so very fearsome. I mean, they were one of the absolute best in baseball last year, headed by Zach Green.
Yeah, they're three-headed outfield monster right now of Corbin Carroll, Adriel Radney, and Zach Green. When you can put AJ Gracia at, by my scout, a 60-61 right fielder into the DH slot, you have a very, very talented outfield. Corbin Carroll being arguably the worst of those three at this point, just because of where he's at in his career and his regression. He's still putting up decent fielding numbers, decent base running numbers, but he's a complete shell of what he used to be. Fortunately for Arizona, that doesn't matter when you have the combination of Silver Slugger winner Adriel Radney in center field, and like you mentioned, superstar Zach Green, who, at least by my scout, has every single major batting rating except I at 70 or higher. And in the same way that Arizona has that extremely potent outfield core, the LA Dodgers are honestly not too far off. Braden Montgomery decided to come back for one more year in arbitration, and he's been excellent ever since he came to LA. He had another great year last year, almost hit 30 home runs for the fourth time in 5 years, which for a guy that's mostly been playing on a losing team, that's pretty impressive. His raw power is second to none on that roster. And fortunately for him, he does have some support coming up through the minors right now. The Dodgers have two very promising young outfielders in Clint Kisler and Mike Palm. I'm not sure which one of them will end up being the true center fielder by the time that this all pans out, but both of them had a great year in AAA last year. And there's a chance that both end up making the roster out of spring this year.
100%. And really, I think the retention of Andy Pajes has told me that Los Angeles still believes that they can compete for a wild card, even if not for the division. They've really been snake bitten over the last few years, and it's been quite an unfortunate team to follow if you're a Dodgers fan, because you have the early retirement of Shohei Ohtani a few years back, even when he was still in his prime. I think he came off of an MVP, or at least an MVP caliber season when he retired. You have a pitching staff that's been, decent at the top, but unfortunately just hasn't been able to support a lineup that for the last, I don't know, 5 years going has been top five in the National League. So I'm not too worried about how this lineup is going to perform because we've seen how it has time and again. I'm hoping that the addition of Braden Nett through free agency, stolen away from their rivals in San Francisco, it can really help bolster a rotation that has basically just been Roki and friends at this point.
Yeah, the last thing I want to touch on here for the Dodgers is their catching situation. Dalton Rushing has been fantastic for them pretty much throughout the whole duration of the file. He puts up a pretty consistent presence, at least on offense. Now, the thing is, he has a huge defensive deficiency, not very efficient behind the plate, throws out a decent number of runners, but his framing runs has been very, very much to be desired over the duration of this league. Now, fortunately, last year, Atsuhiro Mukai was one of the top international free agents that came out of Japan, and the GM for the Dodgers was able to scoop him up right away. Unfortunately, in that regard, though, Mukai had a very, very lackluster season. He only had 250 plate appearances with a 54 OPS plus, and he didn't get hurt. So that's just strictly underperforming his contract, which at 14 mil a year isn't cheap, but he does still have the ratings at least to back up what could be a productive player behind the plate. He does have really good fielding ratings, and he performed well behind the plate last year. He just needs to be able to make a bit of an adjustment and improve on those offensive numbers, and hopefully that can help balance out a bit of that defensive deficiency from Dalton Rushing moving forward.
Finally, let's move to the class of the NL and the class of the NL West last year, the Colorado Rockies. Now, finally, Rocktober became a reality as the Rockies stormed into the postseason after having a 100 plus win season, their very first winning season in the history of Top Shelf. And my goodness, did they make moves? They had an MVP. I'm really excited to see what they're going to do this year. But they did have some major departures, as a couple of their rental pieces they picked with the deadline did end up not being retained.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Victor Cavazos was the most valuable player in the National League last year, and he's turned out to be one of the most exciting young players we've ever seen in Top Shelf. He was the second overall pick back in 2029, and he was already pretty well developed coming out of that draft. I think we all knew that he would hit the majors pretty soon, and it only took him one full season to make it to Colorado. And ever since he hit the majors, he's been on fire. He was able to, this past season, put up a whopping 55 doubles, and it actually is lower than the total that we thought he was going to hit because he was at 41 or 43 or something by the trade deadline. If he didn't have that slight drop off at the end of the season, we would be talking about record numbers here.
Yeah, it was really unfortunate for the Rockies that he actually missed the postseason or missed a majority of the postseason with his injury at the end of the year. But, Colorado is really going to be looking to bounce back after they lost kind of a demoralizing first round series to the eventual champ San Diego Padres. Now, the Rockies are built very solidly from top to bottom. We know that the lineup is always going to perform over there in Coors. They have a ton of power. They have, as we've mentioned, the MVP leading off with Victor Cavazos. But I'm interested to see what the rotation is going to do, as it's been up and down, but there's a lot of talent still left over there.
Yeah, the rotation's been pretty solid over the last few years. The one player that I think stands out to me as having potential for a breakout this year is Josh Easley. He was their second round pick a few years back, and he's been in the majors a couple of years now, but he hasn't had that one breakout campaign that I think he's capable of. He does have four pitches. He has really high stamina, really strong ground ball movement profile, which all plays excellently at Coors Field in particular. But his ratings have kind of dropped recently. He's been back and forth between the majors and the minors, and he's starting to develop some injury concerns as well. Last year, he finally hit the fragile tag after being on the injured list a total of 5 times just in the second half of the year alone. So if he can actually get his stuff together, it's only his first year of arbitration. He's still going to be under team control for a few more years, and Colorado could really use one of those reliable number ones that a lot of the other teams in the NL West can boast right now.
Yeah, I think that's basically their main weakness. They don't have a default number one starter that you can hand the ball to on a game seven and feel super comfortable. Alexander Campos, I think, was on the way to being that guy. We have him 56-56, but he was pitching brilliantly last year at a 193 ERA plus in 24 starts, a 224 ERA. Again, this is all in Coors Field, so that's even more impressive. Unfortunately, his season was cut a bit short by injury, so he didn't really get to finish that full body of work, and which likely would have led to a Cy Young award. But we're hoping that he, along with former Cy Young award winner Jackson Baker, really find a next gear so that they can go toe to toe with these absolute monsters at the head of the rotation in the rest of the NL West. Moving coast to coast, we're going to talk about the NL East next. And speaking of star starting pitchers, let's talk about the Washington Nationals, who are studded with starting pitching talent, but they actually just extended reigning Cy Young Award winner Mason Murdock.
Yeah, the Washington GM made a really smart call, in my opinion, by extending Murdoch for 7 years, $190 million. The structure of this deal is pretty interesting. I wonder if it has to do with how Washington sees their competitive window, because there's an opt out after 4 seasons, and the majority of the contract is front loaded in the deal. The back half drops down significantly with a really cheap player option at the end, and it makes me wonder if Washington's trying to capitalize on the here and now with some of their young talent, because they also just recently extended James Wood and Carson Williams over the last couple of years. So they do have a pretty strong core going at least into 2036.
100%. I think it was really important for a team like Washington to lock up their key pieces, and they definitely did that. Now, this team was really, really close to a postseason berth last year. Unfortunately, as we all watched live in the final week of the season, they did fall to a bit of a collapse and missed the playoffs by just a game. But this upcoming year, you should really expect a bounce back from Noah Schultz, who still has very, very good ratings by my scout and won a Cy Young just a couple of seasons ago. And then combined with Murdoch, you have one of the best 1-2s in all of baseball. And then you have guys like Ray Jarity Merite, you have Angler, you have Trevor McDonald and Yuki Takahashi, who are like competing for that number 5 spot, who aren't as strong, but with how good the rest of the rotation is, you may not need a world beater in that fifth starter position.
Yeah, Washington does already have a pretty formidable offense to back up that rotation. It's mostly pieces who have been here for a few years now, between James Wood, Edwin Arroyo, Carson Williams. Even Jordan Diaz put up pretty good numbers for them in a limited capacity last year at first base. Now, coming into this year, Washington picked up the contract of one major player in left fielder Hector Rodriguez, who spent 3 solid years in Cincinnati playing very exceptional ball, almost having the exact same slash line every single year. And then last year took a tremendous step back and was finally traded out. He's still going to be under contract for another 6 years. So it's a bit of a commitment by Washington, but at least he's able to play pretty decent defense on top of that. And he'll hopefully fill in nicely opposite James Wood to give that outfield a bit more of a name for itself.
One final thing I want to talk about with Washington is also, I always try to put these spring training ideas with a grain of salt because I know that many GMs in past podcasts have mentioned to us after the publication that, oh, I've just put this guy here to get some experience or we're just experimenting. But I think it is worth noting that Michael King, who had a pretty decent year for them last year and has been a pretty solid starter over the course of his Washington career, is currently being posted as a stopper in the bullpen. Now, he's still sitting at 55 stamina. We have him as a 52 starting pitcher. So he definitely has the chops still to start. But I'm wondering what the strategy might be there for the Nationals if they want to put him there instead of one of these weaker relievers.
He did have his worst season since we began this league, just in terms of WAR. His lowest total up until last year was 3.1, and last year was zero point 0.9 across 31 starts, which is atrocious for what we're used to from Michael King. He's on the last year of his deal, so it's not like Washington has to commit to any major retooling plans for his arsenal or his role on the team or anything like that. But like you said, if he's just going to be there to eat up innings, might as well put him in a position where he can make an impact if the rest of your rotation is strong enough to hold its own.
Moving over to another team in the East, we have the Atlanta Braves. Now, this team didn't make too many changes over the offseason, and they were unfortunately a bit further out from the postseason picture than I think they expected. They did shore up the rotation a little bit by picking up veteran starting pitcher Yumin Lin in a trade with the Chicago Cubs. But one of the most important things I think for Atlanta is actually outside of the roster in that trainer Rick Jamieson retired. Now, Rick Jamieson is a name that most OOTP veterans know, and in Top Shelf, it's no different. He was one of the absolute best in the business at keeping players healthy, and Atlanta hasn't really endured too many long term injuries over the course of Top Shelf's life. We'll have to see what happens now that they've hired a new trainer and if that changes, because he was one of the major hirings at the inception of the league that really helped shape Atlanta into a contender.
Yeah, it looks like Dave Lennon is going to be the team trainer for the next 5 years in Atlanta, making a fraction of the salary that Jamieson was commanding, but he's completely focused on prevention. Has awful ratings for rehab, but really, really top tier, excellent, legendary, or outstanding ratings for all the prevention ratings right there. So hopefully Atlanta's more injury prone players don't suffer too much as a result of this. Now, in our last episode, we talked about Atlanta as potentially having a make or break trade deadline. We weren't sure whether some of those salaries would be picked up or player options, or whether Atlanta would be trying to sell some people off just because of expiring deals. What ended up happening was Austin Riley walked, but Atlanta turned around and re-signed Michael Harris II for an additional 6 years. So that signals to me that they at least still see one of their pieces, one of their core pieces in Michael Harris as being integral to continuing this competitive window and not feeling like it's time to completely break things down. And that should be good for the Atlanta fans to have something to look forward to. Philadelphia, in the same breath, has a similar situation, but they already took care of it. Brian Bales has been their ace for a number of years now, into his coming up on his fourth year of major league service, and he's gotten better year in and year out. But Philadelphia smartly locked him down for 8 years at the beginning of last season. It's about a 20 to 22 million dollar AAV across the whole duration of the contract, peaking at 25 mil for the last 4 years. But Brian Bales is in that same mold that Aristigueta is in. He's sort of the face of the team, really popular with the fans, isn't fragile by any means, and can put on a really consistent performance across 30 to 33 starts year in, year out. Philadelphia has him at the front of the rotation. They have Ali to back him up, and they just recently signed Luis Gastelum, who had been with St. Louis for the last 4 years.
Yeah, the pick of Gastelum is really, really good for Philadelphia, as I know that they've been pushing towards trying to be competitive in the last few years. Unfortunately, some of their moves haven't quite panned out, but I really do like that addition because combined with Bales and last year's Rookie of the Year, Ognieslav Ali, this is a pretty formidable top three starters and one of the better rotations in the National League East for sure.
Yeah, Philly definitely has to fill out the back part of their rotation, but they have plenty of options. I know that on their roster currently, they have Kevin Velasco, who I think has a pretty good shot at making it because he was in that same role last year. But I also think Julio Polanco could make a pretty decent case for being in the rotation. Last year and the year before, he was used primarily as a bullpen guy, but I have him as a reliever at 53, 57. I can't imagine he's too much worse as a starter because he's still developing and he's only 26 years old. He has a good 5 pitch mix, decent control, and decent stamina. I think if it was me, I'd be able to slot him in, probably in my 3 hole, possibly toward the back end. But I think he definitely has a leg up in landing one of those back half of the rotation spots.
I definitely think that rotation battle is going to be interesting as Kevin Velasco has really good ratings, but he's unfortunately not really produced to the level that you expect from a guy with this level of talent so far. So I don't know how much more runway Philadelphia is willing to give, especially when they're trying to start a new competitive window here. I think that this year is as good as any, as Miami, who we'll get to, had a bit of a tear down, and now there's a bit of a power vacuum at the top of the division. But one of the other things too is that their lineup is actually quite good. Jose Corona, who was an international free agent a few years back, has been quite good for them. He's put up pretty much identical OPS pluses in the last couple of seasons and hit 30 home runs. They have Eduardo Tate, who is excellent. They have Ray Pease, who is growing into his own at third base, and Victor Arias and Riley Green, who was also traded for. Unfortunately, he'll be injured for the start of the year, but when they get him back pretty early on into April, they should be looking at a relatively fearsome lineup.
One of the other teams in the NL East that I think most of us have expected a little bit more out of is the New York Mets. It seems like year in and year out, they are not performing up to standards, and it's become almost a tired act for the rest of the division. New York Mets don't even seem like they're real contenders at sometimes. Fortunately for them right now, I think their young rotation is actually pretty promising between Luis Cabrera and Irvin Coda. Both of those guys are definitely primed to perform for the foreseeable future. Neither guy right now is signed long term, and I think they're both definitely good candidates to be signed long term. But I think it depends on how the Mets are going to go about determining their competitive window. They don't have Soto on the payroll anymore, which is helpful in the sense that it frees up a spot for maybe a younger guy to fill that void. But they're still stuck with George Kirby and Bryce Miller on the payroll, who aren't doing a whole lot of anything. And assuming that Bryce Eldridge is putting up similar numbers to the first 2 years he has here in the Big Apple, he's been regressing at a pretty steady pace as well, which is really unfortunate considering the promise that he had. But it's not like New York is going down without a fight. They made a couple good additions of their own.
Yeah, chiefly for me is going to be the addition of starting pitcher David Festa. Again, we talked about him a bit in the Minnesota segment. Definitely a talented pitcher. Now, he does come with some risks, labeled again clubhouse cancer. But when you have a team that's really trying to rebuild itself out of scratch, sometimes you have to take a risk. And sometimes that means betting on talent over chemistry with a guy like Festa. The other pickups are James Triantos, who has led the league in steals before. Relief pitcher Cade Smith has been very, very good in the past too, and that should help shore up this bullpen. And New York is going to be getting some money free over the next few years, so we'll have to see whether or not they're able to actually build around this. But with the number of moves they made this offseason, it does look like they're trying to be intentional about the transition away from that Soto expensive era into a newer, younger era going forward.
Finally, we go to one of the more interesting storylines in the NL East. The first place Miami Marlins, who have actually gone through quite the fire sale this offseason, trying to offload a number of their big contracts and take on some promising prospects in the hope that they can retool, rebuild a little bit, and come back strong in a couple of years.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is kind of the reality of all these small market teams. Miami has done really, really well for itself to stay competitive for most of top shelf's lifespan, but unfortunately, the bill comes due every time. And while they have made some strides to push themselves out of the absolute basement of the player budgets, they do need to make a bit of a change this offseason, especially after not making it very far in the postseason. So they did have a number of huge departures. They had third baseman Kobe Mayo, who's been very, very good for them, leave to go to Cleveland. Starting pitchers Eric Vera, Eric Yeager were both traded away, who were stalwart rotation pieces. Bo Brisky is gone. Starting pitcher Johnny King as well from the rotation last year, gone. And relief pitcher Carlos Ponce, who is a bit more of a veteran reliever, but definitely fetched them at least a couple of assets, gone as well. So this is a completely reshaped Miami team that is missing most of its stars. I think the only real leftover from that era that's known to most of Top Shelf is going to be Jackson Merrill here, who is still chugging along, playing a very good center field here in Miami, even though his bat has started to cool off and fall off as he's aged. But we are looking now at Miami's major acquisitions of number 85 prospect Julio Arias and number 69 prospect David Escobar.
Yeah, Miami did acquire some pretty good prospects. I know that Escobar is probably a little bit closer to the majors than some other prospects that I could have sent over. But Miami also has a couple of under the radar acquisitions on their major league roster right now. Josh Kennedy, the left fielder who's gone through a couple different trades over the last couple of years, made his way over to Miami in that Johnny King deal. He's ready for the majors right away. He has been in AAA playing really well over the last 2 seasons, and he doesn't have that much more development to go. He's probably going to slot in as a fourth outfielder to start just because the combination of John Cruz, Jackson Merrill, Slater DeBrun, and Aaron Estrada is still very strong at the top of that Miami lineup. But Kennedy, at least for me, has been full green development for a couple years now, and his real only downfall is that he needs to get better on defense. So as long as he can even get some at-bats in at DH or play every fifth day or something like that, then Miami has a pretty strong replacement outfielder on their hands just from that one trade with Milwaukee.
Yeah, I think Miami has been very, very good at getting value out of these trades. It's how he built his contender in the first place. And while they unfortunately came about as close as you can possibly get to winning that World Series title without getting it, I mean, they lost in 7 games after being up 3-0. I'm really confident in the Miami GM's vision to get his team back to relevance sooner rather than later. Moving now to the NL Central, we have another team that's been making some major changes this offseason, the St. Louis Cardinals. They had a bunch of foundational pieces from their last competitive team depart in free agency and depart via the qualifying offer.
Yeah, the St. Louis GM went hard in free agency to bring in two fairly high rated pitchers. Cade Povich, the starting pitcher for Baltimore for many years, ended the season with the White Sox last year, pitching to a 2 ERA in the last 19 games. Fantastic from him. And now he signed a 2 year deal worth 28 mil with the Cardinals. And then on the back end of the bullpen, Sterling Paddock has come in. He has gone around the league a couple times in the last 3 or 4 seasons, had his most success last year with Baltimore, and now he actually has cashed in on a big payday, signing for 4 years here with St. Louis.
Yeah, these guys coming back here definitely are the types of pieces that you like as supplementary options on a contending team. But it's interesting to me that they're actually going to St. Louis because you have guys like JJ Weatherholt, who was not extended, starting pitcher Luis Gastelum, who has been an ace here in St. Louis for a number of years. He was not extended. Other pieces like first baseman Nolan Shanwell, who had a good year, and relief pitcher Bradley Rodriguez also had a good year. Both left in free agency. So I'm curious as to what you think the direction of this franchise is right now.
I mean, I think they're doing decently. I think one of the big factors over the next few years is going to be the decision this year whether or not to extend their center fielder, Velasquez. He's been a superstar in the league for pretty much as long as he's been in the league now, all 5 years. And he's a excellent fielder, excellent hitter at the top of the lineup, plays a premier position, pretty much a year in, year out 5 WAR candidate. He's young enough where he could still headline either a major blockbuster trade or be the centerpiece of the new competitive window for the Cardinals. It is timed rather awkwardly with Jordan Walker having an opt out after this year, just because he's been sort of the face of the franchise in the whole duration of Top Shelf. So I'm guessing that the Cardinals are going to be making a huge decision probably by the trade deadline this year, just because the team record might dictate whether Walker wants to opt in or opt out, and Velasquez could still fetch a couple really big pieces if the Cardinals don't end up working out this season.
Another team that's been making changes this offseason, not necessarily on the roster, is the Cincinnati Reds. Now, we've had the Reds as one of the teams in Top Shelf's history that's been a little bit down on their luck. They haven't had great winning seasons in the last few years, and unfortunately, the roster's been had a lot of turnover along with some GM turnover. However, with some stability this offseason, we were getting some signals that Cincinnati might be looking to contend a little sooner than we thought.
Yeah, since he has a few good pieces that they picked up in free agency, most of them are on 1 year deals though, so it's probably just a stopgap year for the time being until they can really get their footing. They have a really, really strong pitching core led by their ace Terry Martinez. He was someone who was on my radar for the last few seasons as a really up and comer starting pitcher that I might want to get my hands on. I went a different direction, but Cincinnati has a great piece to build off of. Now, this season, they've signed quite a few of these players that are more in their mid to late 30s. So that's why I think it's just a stopgap here. Pitchers such as Gavin Williams, Luis Garcia, Max Meyer, Wellington Arcena, All of those guys are sort of on the back end of their careers, and they've put up good numbers here and there, but they're not going to stand out in any major way. I think the one player that Cincinnati did pick up that could actually break out is center fielder Byron Churio, who went from Minnesota to Detroit a couple years ago and is now coming over to Cincy. He's going to be entering his last year of arbitration.
Yeah, Churio had a really nice year last year for Detroit in abbreviated time. Played 100 games and put up a 120 OPS plus with about 3 WAR. And his ratings haven't really moved downward in the last couple of years by my scouts estimate anyway. So I am looking to see if he can keep the lineup a little bit more consistent there in Cincinnati.
Yeah, I usually stay away from players who develop that wrecked injury proneness tag before the age of 30. I mean, Churio's had it for a couple of years now, unfortunately, but he's still at a pretty affordable contract level. His last year of ARB is only expected at 10 million, which is pretty low for that level of salary arbitration. But he's really a contact bat. He's the kind of guy that you want getting on base at the top of the lineup. He's not going to play incredible defense one way or the other, but he definitely fits a need for them. And players like that provide a lot of stability as long as they're able to still get on base for the younger bats that you might want to be developing further down in the lineup. And speaking of younger bats, we have the Pittsburgh Pirates coming into the season having made a couple of nice additions between starting pitcher Logan Gilbert and first baseman Nolan Schubert.
When he got hurt.
Pittsburgh definitely can still capitalize on Connor Griffin's young contract. He still has another 5 years to go at a very affordable number. Even though it is Pittsburgh, a small market team where 25 mil isn't just any number to them, Connor Griffin's been the face of that franchise for many years now. And between him, Alexis Ochoa, and Howell Whelan coming up, Pittsburgh has a fantastic 1, 2, 3 right at the top of their lineup. One of their players that I have been keeping my eye on for a couple of years now is who's going to be their first baseman this year, Rich Hammond. He played some shortstop in the minors. I think he was sort of miscast in that role. But at least by my scout, he has 65 grade power, 70 grade eye, and not the worst avoid Ks rating. He's not in that 20 to 25 range. So I think he could be a potential breakout candidate for Pittsburgh, but he hasn't been in the majors yet. He's going to start the year on the major league roster, which is pretty important for him. And he's going to be right in that cleanup spot, right behind Whelan. So between those young players and Pittsburgh leaning all in on Trevor Hansen being their new ace of the future, I think they could make a splash this year in what's a pretty strong division. I don't think they're going to be taking the top off of Chicago or Milwaukee, let's say, but I think they could definitely crack 500 this year.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty optimistic on Pittsburgh's chances this year. If you look at their lineups and their pitching rotation, just by their raw ratings, they really do have a lot of players that have very visible talent. Like you mentioned, Ochoa, Griffin, Whelan, those guys are all really nice. I also want to point out DH Rich Sharp. Looks like he has some offensive maturity. I know over the last 3 years he hasn't had super consistent output, but I do think that his ratings show that he probably could be one of those guys that could break out a little further, and he's only 25. It'll be up to whether the Pirates can put together the supplemental pieces to support their stars going forward that decides whether or not they're actually going to become real contenders for something like a wild card. Because they did trade in this last season Paul Skeens away. He was their longtime guy, won a Cy Young for them. And while you're right that they do have Trevor Hansen to take over the mantle, it'll be up to them to get some consistency through the roster. And we've seen, unfortunately, some both injury and underperformance from them. And we're hoping that that doesn't happen again this year.
On that note, Jacob, speaking of underperformance, the Chicago Cubs are coming into the season having made a few pretty important moves. Davison De Los Santos wasn't living up to that contract that Chicago had him on, and so they shipped him off. And then they brought in Onishi from Boston, who you thought was pretty decent, but by your standards, he was underperforming because he wasn't stealing bases with his blue speed and stealing metrics, which was honestly kind of crazy because he was hitting leadoff for 2 years. But Chicago has now extended both Russell Shepard and Sean Gamble for the next 5 years and re signed Kazunori Kawasaki, who's been one of those huge feast or famine hitters over the last 3 years.
Yeah, Chicago had a really great offseason, in my opinion, and try not to say that just as a bias for taking Onishi. I actually still really like Masahiro Onishi as a player. Yes, you are right that he wasn't stealing as many bases as I would have liked, but he was definitely scoring runs and getting on base at a very, very high clip in the leadoff spot. So it's not like he was clogging the bases, even though he wasn't stealing them. I ended up having to move him simply because his cost was too great for me at the time. And we are moving into a bit more of a rebuild period, as mentioned earlier. Another move that they made this offseason that I really, really liked was taking starting pitcher Joel Lara from the New York Mets. Lara has been pretty good over the last couple of years. He did have a bit of an abbreviated stint in 2031. He hasn't even had a full year in the majors technically, but he does have the ratings to be a starter. And I know that Chicago is going to be trying him in that fifth starter spot. So even though he had a really good year in relief last year, I think that sets a really high floor in the case that he doesn't work out as a starter. But with Chicago looking for any sort of continued pitching help to raise the ceiling of their team, I like that move a lot.
Yeah, the Lara trade was something that I didn't really see coming just because, like you said, he pitched in a relief role exclusively last year. He does have the stamina to turn into a starter. Like that part's not the question. To me, I always look for relievers converting to starters as having more than two pitches. If you're a back end reliever, for instance, and you have high velocity, you can get away with like a fastball and a hard breaking ball. You look at people in real life like Mason Miller, Edwin Diaz, people like that, where you are just relying on the velocity and then something to change the batter's eye line. Starting pitchers, I think just because you're seeing the lineup multiple times around, you need a few more tools to play with. Joel Lara, at least for me, has two fully developed pitches in his 65 grade fastball and curveball. His changeup and sinker leave a lot to be desired, though. I have his changeup at 40-50 and his sinker at 35-40. I'm not saying that he can't do it. Like he's done it before in the minors, but I do think that if he wants to be consistent as a starter and for Chicago to rely on him down the stretch, if they're going to be a playoff team like they have been for the last 3 years, I think he does need to sort of overperform what his ratings are saying right now.
Yeah, and I think that point speaks to me about one of the things that the Chicago team has still been looking for over the last few years is that really reliable ace starting pitcher that you can give the ball to in the playoffs. Their starting rotation actually performed very, very well over the course of last year. I think they were, by my memory, a top five unit. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that they weren't very good. But a lot of the times in a short playoff series, they're guys that you really have faith in to take you 7 innings and give you a chance to win. And I know that Chicago has struggled with finding that guy that you can basically trust in any matchup, even though all their players are very good. So I'm wondering whether or not they'll be able to keep that consistency through the regular season. As last year, even though they ended up as a playoff team, they were definitely seesawing between first and third and battling big losing streaks, big winning streaks. So if they can get a little more consistency this year, and I don't know, maybe if something happens at the deadline or they get some big development from starting pitcher Luis Seapress, maybe they can be a bit bigger of a playoff contender. And combined with the playoff prowess of Kazunori Kawasaki, who has, even though he's been feast and famine in the regular season, he's been nothing but feast in the playoffs. The final team we have in the podcast today is the Milwaukee Brewers. Now, they are the picture of consistency and top shelf. They've been one of the best teams every single year, pretty much. They have a great rotation, great lineup, and one of the things that they haven't had any issues with fielding is an ace. They actually also added to that starting rotation this offseason Johnny King in a trade for Miami. And that just helps bolster an aging rotation that's currently headed by Logan Webb, that has young guys like Brian Taylor and Blake Illich ready to continue and take the reins as these guys age into their late 30s.
Milwaukee's been developing pitchers pretty consistently over the last few years. I think most of us have looked at their bullpen as their strength just because they have some really, really consistent, high velocity, high stuff guys. Ben Landers actually made a huge splash at the end of last year because he wasn't the closer and he won the NL Rolaids Relief Man of the Year award. Led the league with 87 games played and 34 holds. He wasn't even in a stopper role. He probably could be with 35 stamina, the same way that we saw Boston roll out Wen Hui Pan last year, just to get up a few more innings. But Honestly, in Milwaukee's case, they sort of have that embarrassment of riches bullpen. Bill Horton is all green, Chris Graves all green, Jose Fermin is still there. He's just barely under green by my scout. He's 59-59. So they've got this whole plethora of relievers that's been stocking up for a number of years now. I think Ryan Taylor finally reaching the peak of his potential is a huge deal for Milwaukee, even though he has lost a little bit of stamina, just because it was only a few years ago that Ryan Taylor was actually on the trade block for a majority of the season. He was on the trade block, I think, as recently as the 2030 season before he really took off in the majors. And fortunately for Milwaukee, they kept him and they won a title with him. So as long as Ryan Taylor can stay healthy, sort of cross our fingers about that because he has a very extensive injury history. They at least have a 23-year-old that could replace Logan Webb at the front of the rotation. Like you said, once he ages out, but Johnny King's completely fine on his own. He does only have one major successful year at the major league level, that being last year, with a 6.3 WAR. It's more than 4 WAR higher than any of his other seasons. So I don't know if that's necessarily an anomaly, but he was really good for Miami, and Milwaukee doesn't have to pay a lot for him for the next few years because he's still within that arbitration window. So Johnny King also could just fit right in, and if Milwaukee for over the next couple years has Johnny King and Ryan Taylor, that 1-2 punch at the top of the rotation, they're still going to be competitive for years to come.
Yeah, Milwaukee has been one of the best big market teams at managing age and finances with a lot of their players. I think the only real quote unquote strikeout that they've had in that regard was the unfortunate eventual retirement of Shane McClanahan, who just became too injured and had to retire instead of rehab. But otherwise, I mean, they've been the guys to pick up big contracts, move big contracts, and it just seems like every year when I look at the Milwaukee roster, there's always somebody good in a spot. I mean, one of the major departures they had this year was first baseman Mike Bove, who has had extensive postseason experience with them, somebody who you'd always see showing up on the highlight sheets. But they gave him the qualifying offer, let him reject it, and then let him move on. And after that, they haven't missed a beat. Cam Smith now is currently lined up to slot in that first base spot with Steve Beard taking over at third base. And you have internal guys like Jackson Churio, who has been nothing but great for them. He's been extended for another 5 years. And the aforementioned Ryan Taylor, like you said, since he's stuck there for another 8 years, I mean, they have this huge piece that is going to be around until at least age 31, or at least under contract until age 31. And I just don't see at the moment the Milwaukee Brewers slowing down.
As yet another offseason comes to a close, and with a new season on the horizon, 2033 promises to be anything but predictable. We look forward to finding out what these new look rosters have in store for us. Play ball!